Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. The Ukraine War Frontline update for the 2nd of December 2023. If you've not seen my maps before, please pause the video and look at the key that's on the screen now. We'll go to the northeast sector first, but as you can see from the map, there's a lot of red pins suggesting that the Russians have made large advances, or a number of advances, right up and down the front line. They are all from Syriac Maps, and Syriac Maps does get quite excited about Russian advances, and I present them as one of my sources because it's interesting to compare what the Russians say as opposed to what the Ukrainians say. They are, sometimes right, and sometimes quicker than other mappers to suggest Russian advances. Of course, the Russian MOD will say an awful lot of stuff, and sometimes they are correct. And so therefore, sometimes the mapping is on point and current. But also, as Andrew Perpetua said the other night in one of his live streams, some of these mappers, like Syriac Maps, I think, will suggest an advance or some territory gained at the slightest hint of a human being with a Russian identity being in that general area. It's like, right, the Russians advance there, rather than it just being a single human, and they are eventually either taken out or run back the other direction or whatever, is not robust control and therefore doesn't represent Russian control really. And so we need to be careful, and we'll come on to talk about this with regard to Marinka soon. But I asked Andrew Perpetua on his live stream the other night, the mapper that's represented by the blue lines here, and about what he thinks of these Russian attacks at the moment. Is this like a concerted offensive effort, or is there some other explanation? Actually, what he said I thought was pretty reasonable, which is it appears it's just finishing off the offensives they had started previously, but were kind of interrupted by the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So when they were attacking Avdiivka, we've got to remember that Avdiivka, at the time of the Bakhmut, the height of the Bakhmut attack, Avdiivka was going off, and it had been incredibly intensive it has been intensive for an awful long time. If you remember, I think Francis Farrell, from the Kiev Independent, was reporting from Avdiivka saying, it is really, really rough there. It's highly attritional for the Ukrainians as well as the Russians. We're losing a lot of troops there. Don't forget about Avdiivka while all the attention is turned on Bakhmut. So the Russians were trying to take Avdiivka, right? They were also trying to take Bakhmut. And so what they're doing in Bakhmut now is kind of still part of that initial, trying to take Bakhmut and move on to Chasiv Yar. It was just that they were interrupted. What happened is Wagner pulled out, because basically they culminated. Wagner pulled out, Prigozhin did his thing, and the Russian conventional armed forces had to come in and replace them. And that was when the Ukrainians attacked, as they were there was this rotation going on, replacement going on. There was a lack of cohesion from the Russian forces, and the Ukrainians seized the initiative. Actually, as time has gone on, the Russians have been able to pile in some troops to the area to support their efforts there, and that initiative has switched as things have happened, in different places along the front line, and troops have been redeployed from one area to the other on both sides. And what was happening around, say, Cherny here, Torska, that was happening. The Russians took this large salient here, and they were moving forward. They were trying to move towards the Oskil River. This was all taken from them in that lightning counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. Well, the Russians have been trying to take that back ever since, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive obviously put that on pause, but it's like they're just trying to finish the job. Same with the Marinka. Whatever's happened there, and we'll talk about that later, that's not some new offensive. So it's interesting, these different ways that you can look at what the Russians are doing. Or is this just a new phase and another big push up and down the front lines, as you move from one side doing their offensive to the other side doing their offensive? But it does smack of picking up where they left off type thing. Right, when we go to the ISW, American military think tank, they say that there is geolocated footage published on the 30th showing Russian forces advancing southeast of Vilshana. So just let you know where Vilshana is. Vilshana is up here by Kupiansk, northeast of Kupiansk, and there's advances southeast of Vilshana. I don't know if that's referring to this area. Well, it's not actually, because the geolocations are generally, I mean, I did do this earlier because this is the second time I recorded this because I went all wrong. But basically, the sources that the Ukrainians 14th BDE have repelled Russian attack near Vilshana, destroying 2 tanks and shelling Russian forces. And all of the geolocations are in this area. And that is actually, in fact, that's the furthest forward. The 2 tanks, I think, are behind that. Now, that doesn't suggest an advance. So it depends how you define the word advance. So actually, when you are troops and columns and mechanized equipment advancing on the enemy, you can be well behind your own lines, and you're advancing from the contact line. Actually, it's not that people are standing around here waiting to shoot each other at the contact line. This is a grey zone, and we're not really sure what's going on. I know it says here that the Russians control from either the blue or the red line there. You'll have a grey zone here and the Ukrainians somewhere back here. Well, actually, the Russians are technically, I suppose, advancing, as in they're moving forward towards the Ukrainian line. But to me, it's a little bit, I don't know, it's a bit of a problematic word, because you might think from reading that means, and maybe they are signifying that means that the Russians have moved forward from their defensive position, their line, and they have taken territory. Well, that doesn't tell you that at all. It's behind both of the mappers' lines by some considerable distance. Nonetheless, that is what the ISW said there. Just in general about this area, the front line, Ukrainian ground forces spokesperson Fitio has reported that Russian forces somewhat reduced the intensity of attacks in the Kupiansk and Liman directions and are regrouping in the Liman direction. He added that Russian forces have a large stockpile of glide bombs and conduct strikes with these glide bombs on the Kupiansk-Liman front line. Ukrainian military observer Mashevets claimed that Russian forces made tactical advances west and south of Crimea, and actually the advance west of Crimea could well be these ones that we'll come on to in a second that Surek Maps details. Now, there are no tweets to go alongside this, but Surek Maps does have a change in their mapping around the Yahidny Ivanivka area, where they might well have moved to the west a little bit, and also up here by the Oskil River in its northern in the northern region here. This is difficult for the Russians to take. So they've taken some land across a lake, but still on the eastern side of the Oskil River as it meanders around there. Why it's difficult here, you can see these white cliffs. Let's do a bit of 3D and go in here in 3D. So these cliffs are on the western side. I say cliffs, more like a bluffs, chalk bluffs, on the western side of the Oskil River, and actually they give a height advantage to the Ukrainians as they look across the river to the Russian positions, and that is a case all the way up the river, pretty much to the very northern reaches of Kharkiv Oblast there. So the Russians would not only have to ford the river or cross the river with equipment to make inroads, is a bit like the Dnipro River for the Ukrainians. Not only do they need to get across the river, but if they get a foothold, here, actually, this is slightly different from Dnipro, because actually here the Ukrainians have a huge height advantage and can just pick off the Russians as they've crossed the river. So yes, they might well have taken this this head of land here as the river meanders around it, but I don't think that's any serious threat to the Ukrainians, as you can see, they really do have the advantage there. So I don't know that you'll see an awful lot more change to that the mapping around the Oskil River, because it's certainly around here where it's higher ground. This particular area going up to Franikivka, and Dvorichna, this particular line, I don't think the Russians will have too much success, but a little bit there possibly. As we come down past the Ivanivka area, so the Russians have made some advances towards Ivanivka. Turns out that just a little bit further to the south, the Russians have made some advances, and you'd never believe it. I wonder why they made some advances. It turns out it's towards Ivanivka. So who knew? Anyway, this is a more considerable control exchange of territory here. Surek Map says the Russian army advanced east of Terny, taking control over a series of Ukrainian positions within the limits of Donetsk Oblast. And so, yeah, that's the border of Luhansk, Donetsk. They are moving into quite a bit of Ukrainian land there. It's about 4.5 kilometers north to south, and probably about a kilometer or a kilometer and a half, maybe in some areas, in depth the Russians have taken, according to Surat maps. Not yet confirmed by other sources, though. So could be something of a worry for the Ukrainians. And then we come on down past Seversk to the Bakhmut area, and you can see that the Russians have made further gains, according to both Surat maps and deep state maps, in the Bodanivka area. The Institute for the Study of War does make some claims about Bodanivka. So we'll go through this quickly. Ukrainian military observer Mashavets stated that Russian forces captured unspecified positions north of Bodanivka and also northeast of Kromova and north of Kurdyamivka. So Mashavets, that's a Ukrainian observer, saying the Russians have made advances there, here, and then north of Kurdyamivka somewhere, so somewhere in this general area. A Russian mobile blogger claimed on the 30th that Russian forces are advancing southwest of Bakhmut near Klishchivka. Russian sources claimed over the last couple of days that Russian forces are advancing towards Bodanivka, Kromova and Bakivka. One Russian mobile blogger claimed that Russian forces established footholds on the northern and southeastern outskirts of Bodanivka. And that's kind of what Surat Maps is saying. Russian mobile bloggers claim that they are also fighting along the O0506 highway north of Kromova and the T0504 highway south of Kromova. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces successfully attacked near Bodanivka, Ivaniska, Klishchivka and Andriivka, and Ukrainian Ground Forces spokesperson Fitio said that the Russian forces have intensified operations along the entire eastern front. So this is looking challenging for the Ukrainians, as according to those Russian sources. Of course, take that with a pinch of salt, possibly, but I would imagine that actually the Russians are putting on a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians along this entire front. Here, some gains according to Surat maps over the railway line, taking some territory in terms of that tree line and the railway between the northern kind of bend of the railway as it comes round to the north of Klishchivka and between there and Klishchivka and Andriivka, sorry. So that is, again, challenging for the Ukrainians. And then this area around Bodanivka could well be under a lot of pressure. Kromova too. Okay, so coming out of there, we'll come to the south towards Avdiivka. And as you can see, not looking good for the Ukrainians there, at least as according to Russian sources. I must say, Surat Maps did have a separate one for Bakivka Reservoir, just north of Bakhmut near Bodanivka. The Russians are consolidating positions around the pond there, around the reservoir. Nonetheless, we'll go on to Avdiivka, where I was, and here we have Ukraine battle maps and the Avdiivka front. Okay, Russian forces have recently advanced and to take the Dacha area east of Avdiivka, advanced north of Vodyane as well, and made minor gains around Krasnohorivka. So that's north, south, and east. They've gained about 4.1 square kilometers of the 85 square kilometers in the Avdiivka pocket in the past week, mostly fields. So maybe trying to sell that in a positive way, but it is certainly very challenging for the Ukrainians here. Now, that eastern, the Dachas to the east of Avdiivka, not really mentioned by any of the mappers. It's more about north by Krasnohorivka along this railway line by Stepova, and this is where, in fact, many claim that Stepova itself is half under the Russian control. There's been a bit of toing and froing here. The Ukrainians did a counterattack a few days ago and took back this tree line, as according to most people. But the Russians have since themselves countered in that region. And then when we come down to the south of Avdiivka, you've got Vodyane and Opitny and some gains, as according to Surat Maps there. Here, let's read what they have to say. So this is in the northern area first by Stepova and north of Krasnohorivka. This is Surat Map saying the situation on the Avdiivka front from the northern axis. Russian army recovered the previously lost positions around Stepova and the north of the coke plant and reached the pond southeast of Novokalnyove. Meanwhile, so that's there, Meanwhile, from the southern axis, Russian army took control over new positions southeast of Severny, in addition with an important defense structure of the Ukrainian army east of the quarry. So that is to say, this important structure is somewhere in this area. You can see indeed trench lines there. And if they've taken those trench lines and maybe some little kind of dugout structures and whatnot, then you can imagine that could be a bit of a loss for the Ukrainians. But more worrying possibly is this movement towards Severny, which is a kind of like important component of Ukraine's defense of Avdiivka. If you start, I mean, really, where the Russians are at the moment is pretty troubling with regard to the supply line as it comes in the 00542 road, because this will be probably the only paved road into Avdiivka. The rest of them, these kind of farm tracks, will be muddy trails that will be very difficult to navigate this time of year. So as the Russians move slowly north from Opitny Vodyeny area towards Lastochkirny, and as they get across the railway line towards Berdichi, they are more and more able to interdict that main supply route, which is, as I say, a massive challenge. But also you can see over here, south of Tonyenka, that area there is also, very worrying if it's indeed true. Now, the Russian forces have shelled Ukrainian positions. Seems like a vehicle, but 100% isn't visible. Not quite sure what's going on in the footage in the village of Tonyenka west of Avdiivka. So this is geolocated. The Russians are hitting the Ukrainians, shelling the Ukrainians in this position. I mean, you can see where Tonyenka is, so it's going to be somewhere around here, right? So actually, that's even to the northwest, of Tonyenka. As you would expect, the Russian artillery is going to be very active and drones in the area. Right, then we move on to, okay, sorry, don't get ahead of yourself. Let's go to the RSW before we talk about Avdiivka, Marinka. So the mill blogger, Russian mill blogger, claimed that Russian forces control half of Stepover and have advanced up to 200 meters north of the settlement, though that's not been observed or confirmed by the ISW. So that is this claim about Stepover, controlling half of it and possibly controlling ground north of Stepover as well. Unconfirmed yet. Just very difficult, I assume, around Avdiivka. Whether all of those gains have been made, I guess we will see. Always with a grain of salt with regard to Suret maps. So we're going to come to Marinka here, and as you can see, we have Russian gains here. These are in blue, but they should be in red. So sorry about that. That actually suggests that the Russians have taken this ground, but as you can see from Andrew Perpetua's mapping here, that is not taking as much ground as Surat map suggested yesterday, which suddenly the whole of Marinka was taken. The reason why is, I say the reason, there was no other evidence given other than assertions, but the idea that it looked like it may have even been that house there, which is now pretty much rubble, had a Russian flag on top. But actually, Git from Andrew Perpetua's live stream was saying, I'm not going to be as negative here. I think we should take this was some deal of skepticism, because the weather had been absolutely terrible for days. There had been blizzards, you couldn't see anything, and so it would be relatively easy for the Russians to just nip round there in a blizzard, hang a Russian flag up, run back, wait for the blizzard to stop, and then get a drone up to take imagery of that. And then suddenly the claims were that Marinka has fallen and that Russians control it all. And so when I reported this yesterday, and if you don't remember, this is it. So there's no real evidence of anything, control around here. What's going on? It's all sort of covered in snow. But the drone sort of moves on to look at this. This building, and it has a Russian flag there. If you can get rid of see through the watermark, you've got that Russian flag, and so therefore the Russians control all of that area, and that's basically what happened. So I reported that with a little bit of skepticism yesterday. I was like, I'm not really sure, but it could be that Marinka has fallen. And anyway, some of the pro-Russian voices, pro-Kremlin voices in my thread are like, oh, you're not skeptical when Ukrainians make ground, but now you're being skeptical when the Russians take ground. I was like, not really, actually. You need to present just a little bit more evidence. Anyway, let's have a look at some of the claims and then some of the stuff that's since been said. So, yeah, People Global War Monitor probably, I've said before, seems to go along with Surat Maps, even though it's a pro-Ukrainian source, has gone along with Surat Maps here, as they often do, and said that after 22 months, Russia has captured all of the main part of the former town of Marinka. Marinka remains the longest battle in modern history. But then you start seeing these claims coming out. So I reported this morning, and this is from Dmitry from War Translator saying Roman Saponkov says that yesterday's news about the capture of Marinka by Russian forces was a complete farce made up by the new editorial team at the huge MASH Telegram channel. So sorry to go over this again, but unfortunately it's too early to rejoice regarding Marinka. To put it mildly, one unit decided to raise a flag on the outermost house and report on the capture of Marinka as a whole. Perhaps in another war, the capture of a house on the edge would have led to the capture of a village, but a little later. But in this war, this is not at all the case. As a result, the whole country yesterday rode on an emotional swing, exactly as a population of the neighbouring non-state likes to ride. MASH apparently was bought out, and another editorial team of girls designers was put in, turning the channel with 2 million people into a Russian analogue of Trickster. I advise you to immediately unsubscribe from this garbage dump. So this is really stinging. This is a really stinging repudiation of MASH and the claims that they make. But it wasn't the only one. So Tim White saying Russia's been making grand claims about seizing territory, including Marinka. There's a picture of them raising the Aquafresh rag. So Aquafresh is a toothpaste in the UK with the same colours as the Russian flag on a house. But as with Stepova near Bakhmut, Ukraine is still fighting there, but the invaders did make progress. So this is the idea. This is basically in line with Andrew Perpetua, which is they have made progress. They have certainly, moved in the northern and the southern and central, all over what's left of Marinka. The Russians have made gains. But further claims then came out. So even one of Russia's military analysts confirms they have not captured all of Marinka. The TG Telegram channel, Arazmap, gives a realistic update on the situation. Here's a translated version of the post and a screenshot of the communist flag flying on what used to be a house. So, is Marinka captured? How important is this? Remember, this is a Russian source. Russian sources announced the complete capture of Marinka, Donetsk region. However, later they began to say that Ukrainian forces were still sitting in several houses. Posts also appeared about the strategic importance of this victory. How are things really going? Marinka is cut in half by the Osekovaya River and a small reservoir. Judging by recent footage in the southwestern half of the city, the Russian military reached the outskirts and even raised their flag. From this side, Marinka is most likely completely captured. But as far as the northern part, there remains resistance from the Ukrainian armed forces. Until there is a photo or video near the Cathedral of All Saints, it's formerly in Georgievka, but essentially on the border of the city, we can assume that the Russian army does not completely control Marinka. A video with the USSR flag has been published, but it was made in a long-occupied part of the city where there are high-rise buildings. Okay, so this is then going on to talk about this northern area here not being under the control of the Russians, but them pretty much controlling all of that. So it's still substantial. He's talking about George, by the way, when he mentions George, what's he talking? Formerly in Georgievka, that's Hayarivka, which is basically, that means Georgetown. Georgetown. So that is that is another claim by a Russian source. And then finally, Dmitry from War Translated in another post says, even the biggest Russian propagandist Sladkov is telling Russians to calm down about Marinka. Guys, let me start with this. I respect my colleagues from the blogging sphere, and I don't dare point my finger at anyone asking where does this news come from. People write, and this is work, and content is the personal business of the authors. Now let's move on to the topic of controlling Marinka. From the line where our control ends to the end of Marinka to the city limits is 1 kilometer. We still have 1 kilometer to assault in Marinka. I didn't want to get involved in these discussions, but I feel sorry for the readers. This, quote, we already took Marinka has been sold to them for several years now, but those who didn't fight for this settlement, by those who didn't fight for it. The loudest ones came in and immediately announced, we have taken the centre of Marinka, but this centre at that time had long been ours, etc., etc. Why can't we take Marinka? We cannot pass the fields on the right and left. Why can't we go through the fields? We pass through, clear enemy trenches, gain a foothold, but are knocked out by enemy artillery. The counter-battery potential must be increased. The other day we tried to get around Marinka, but for the 100th time, but failed. An old song about artillery reconnaissance. If we take Marinka, and we will take it, no question, then the equally important Kurakovo will be further with Krasnohorivka on the right. We will still crush the Ukrainian army. Avdiivka means a lot in the entire defense of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass. It will be easier later. We will definitely win. I feel it in my reporter's skin, he says. So, okay, in other words, whatever's happened, the Russians haven't taken it. However, they have almost taken it, as according to all of those sources, really. So they say they're 1 kilometer from the front line, which is pretty much that, which is where Andrew Perpetua has the Russian defensive lines, maybe a little more in certain places, maybe less in others. I don't know. The point is that, you know, those making these pointed comments in the threads yesterday, just basically shut up. I will represent what mappers are saying, and I will give my opinion, and I think my opinion's been fairly accurate over the course of this war, which is sometimes conservative in some cases, and sometimes a little more confident in others. But here, I think Marinka won't have fallen yet. I said yesterday, it seems incredibly unlikely that they suddenly in one day take like 8 blocks worth or whatever. However, they are advancing through there. And the reality is there's not really anything left of Marinka. And so defending it is very difficult. The basements are even kind of, broadly destroyed or not really fit for purpose, and buildings certainly largely destroyed. So yeah, the importance of Marinka is it keeps the Russians away from these much more significant places like Kurakovo, as was mentioned earlier, and this reservoir here. You want to keep the Russians away from this conglomeration, this conurbation of settlements there. And Marinka does that. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. All its value is extrinsic in terms of, Krasnohorivka not falling, and then these towns behind. As Andrew Perpetua was talking about last night, the Russians really kind of want this area as far as, a line up from there. Well, actually, this road here to the south is what he was talking about, actually. This is something they really want from Vuhledar right up to Marinka through Pobieda. That would, the Russians would really like to have that. And so this is part of that. You got the intense work they're putting into Novomerkulivka as well. And of course, as we know, the intense work into Vuhledar. So it's all part of gaining really Konstantinivka and this road. So we'll see how that goes on. It is worrying in Marinka. I think its days are numbered. It just wasn't taken yesterday. Whether it falls today or tomorrow, I guess we'll see. And the next question then is, well, how important is that for the Ukrainians and for the Russians? As I say, intrinsically not very important, extrinsically probably quite important. But yeah, somewhat similar to Bakhmut in some respects. So yeah, those are the claims concerning Marinka. Really not a lot to say about Velika Novosilka or Robotina. We'll just go to look at the ISW. It does talk about Marinka itself. Geolocated footage published on December 1st indicates that Russian forces advanced further into western Marinka. However, that geolocated footage was that flag video. Several Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces completely control Marinka, and amplified footage of Russian servicemen also claiming that Russian forces fully control the settlement. Another group of Russian mill bloggers called these reports premature, claiming that Russian forces control about 90 to 95% of Marinka. However, currently available geolocated evidence indicates that Russian forces control no less than 74% of Marinka, but they could control more. as they claim. So the benchmark minimum that ISWs say that the Russians control is 74%, at least 74%. So more likely more. How much more? I guess, as I say, we'll find out at some point. Talking about frozen ground in the Velika Novosilka area. So Russian forces are conducting mutual artillery fire with the Ukrainians while waiting for the mud to freeze over. Waiting for it to freeze over so they can renew ground attacks. So obviously not frozen there, but it looks fairly frozen in many places. There's been quite a bit of snow around. And then as we go to Robotyne, so this salient that appears to be somewhat more positional now, there are elements of the text here, the narrative that the ISW is reporting on, to suggest that the Russians are pushing back in this area too. So Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces are increasingly pressuring Ukrainian forces on the western outskirts of Robotyne. One Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces are building up and conducting intense counterattacks along the entire Kopany, Robotyne, Novopokrovka, Verbove line, and another mill blogger claimed that Russian forces captured positions in the forest areas near Verbove and Ukrainian forces that they had held, for the previous 2 months. In other words, intense pressure by the Russians all the way down here and then all the way up here, and that perhaps some forest areas near Verbove are now under Russian control. And then finally here, one Russian airborne affiliated source complained that VDV units north of Verbove are struggling to deliver ammunition and provisions to frontline VDV positions due to heavy Ukrainian fire, artillery fire, drone use, and high winds. So conditions are challenging for the Russians, but it's certainly not a huge area of success for the Ukrainians at the moment. Very much more positional, perhaps a change in momentum. It can be felt. Right, then we come on down to Krinky particularly, but the Dnipro River area. The ISW says of here, one VDV affiliated mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces attempted to transfer another group of personnel to Krinky via boat on the 30th and December 1st, but the Russian strikes prevented the attempt. Russian mill bloggers claim the Ukrainian forces are trying to advance in forest areas south of Krinky. One prominent mill blogger claimed that Russian airstrikes on Krinky have forced Ukrainian forces to retreat to the northern part of the settlement. So that would be a claim that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back to kind of this area and not so much in the southern reaches of the settlement, or indeed in the forest area. However, other claims are that they are in the forest area and are pushing to the south. So, you know what? Who knows? Yes. So let's go to some of the various claims that I've compiled. Tim White here says Russia has relocated its 337th Airborne Assault Regiment from Zaporizhia to the occupied left bank of Kherson. This indicates the seriousness of the problem for the invaders who've been unable to stop Ukraine crossing the river and expanding territory there. So that's painting matters in a very positive way for the Ukrainians, that the Russians are bringing in some reserves to the area that show that they see this as a big problem. Uneasy situation for occupiers in Krinky. Ukrainian FPVs are everywhere, full control over the sky, says Dmitry in Wall Translated. So this is, I presume, from a Russian source saying Kherson region, our shore, Krinky. They write to us on Krinky, the expletive for the Ukrainians, fly to us. Like on the M4 Don Highway, the swarm of drones is reminiscent of the cartoon about Winnie the Pooh. I am a cloud, 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 and not a bear at all. They do not allow us to come closer or further. Their FPV is dispatched immediately, or we get shelled with a mortar. And if our mortar fires somewhere, everything from the Ukrainians flies at it. Their birds, so their drones, constantly change each other in a carousel. The noise and hum fills the whole forest. They control the roads, see people, and FPVs immediately fly into any car. I've seen an awful lot of footage, FPV drone footage, in the Kherson area. I can verify that it must be really... I don't know. I would hate to get into a vehicle around the Kherson area and drive around, because there aren't too many roads around there. as I've talked about before, there are very few roads, so the ones that there are will be incredibly closely monitored, and then it's kind of driving on tracks otherwise, and that presents its own problems, doesn't it? So the trouble is that our electronic warfare equipment either doesn't exist or they just don't care about it. There are EW suitcases. They say they are quite good. If they could fill them with the whole frontal part of the houses and forests, and put them on the same power supply, and in cooperation with the EW operators, turn them off so that our drones could also fly and immediately turn them on upon return, it would be a fairy tale. But the simple guys are being sent to assault whilst the Nazis control the whole sky. So this is the complaint, that the Russians aren't just playing a clever game here, and they are not using their electronic warfare capabilities. They're not even using the capacity of what they have. No reports add to that. Russian channel Dva Mayora, with a report on the field in the Kherson region, seems like Teplinsky, so he's a guy in charge of this area. He's also in charge of the VDV, the paratroopers. So he isn't able to fix things for the Russians over there. Quote, they do not allow you to approach or move away. The FPV immediately flies, or the Ukrainian Armed Forces mortar is working. So this is a Russian source again. And if our mortar fires somewhere, everything from the Ukrainian flies there. In other words, the Ukrainian counter battery fire is incredibly rapid and pervasive. Their birds, so their drones, constantly change each other in the carousel. So again, that's the same quote from before, slightly different wording though, and indicating the counter battery fire is that effective. And then we have this is Peace 1 giving its Krinky update. Per the Russian-owned mission, Ukrainians control the sky around Krinky through electronic warfare and unlimited first-person view drones. Ukrainian artillery, including mortars, dominates. The Russians are powerless. An interesting comment that reminds me what I wrote a month ago about Zaluzhny. He is trying to implement on a limited scale the necessary conditions to move from positional to maneuver warfare, and in the end win the war. Before anyone says the frontline did not move much, yes, I know there is a Dnipro to cross at scale, and Ukrainians do not have everything in place to scale up that at the moment. However, the Russians continue to pour in new units, first the 810th and now the 104th, because the 810th was supposed to solve the problem, cannot cope. At Krinky, 200 to 300 Ukrainians are slowly advancing against thousands of Russians. They are lions. That's a very positive outlook there. I think as I've said previously, it is a challenge for the Ukrainians here. They really do need to take some more land, and sooner rather than later, but it seems to be very positional, and I think that will be attritional for the Ukrainians as well as for the Russians. Now, just a little comment on General Zavadsky. So he's a deputy commander of I can't remember, one of the groups. Anyway, a high level individual who was killed. There's claims he was killed by mine, but it could well be that he was killed in that possibly a grenade launcher attack on that building by partisans or perhaps even special forces. It's sort of a bit grey as to what happened there. We confirm information from the arrival in the village of Novomayachka. Unfortunately, the information is true. On the 28th, the enemy launched a missile attack on the 10th Special Forces command post. We know that number of dead and wounded, but we won't write about it for now, so it's not to please the enemy. Gentlemen officers, do not forget about the importance of camouflage, dispersal and secrecy of command posts. Your lives and the lives of your subordinates depend on it. Yes, from Novomayachka to the front line is 22 kilometers. Isn't it time for the command of the Dnipro main guard force to think about withdrawing the control points of units and formations to a safer distance from the front line, at least beyond the Novaya Kakhovka, Armyansk border? Otherwise, new arrivals are only a matter of time. Let us recall that at the same time, on November the 28th, the deputy commander of the 14th AK, Major General Vladimir Zavadsky, died. It's November the 28th, yeah. As Vladimir Solovyov said, coincidence? Don't think. So all is not well there. I mean, it's still broadly positive for the Ukrainians, but I think at the moment, things are looking much more challenging, as the Ukrainians just, in my opinion, they need boots on the ground. They do need to mobilize just a considerable force to bring them to bear in any number of places. When there's activity this far, in this much of the front line, then the Ukrainians are going to be struggling to get force quantity into position to make a meaningful difference. So they're just kind of, I think, just about holding the Russians back in a number of places while still trying to prosecute something like an offensive in, say, Krinky and Robotina as well. So, yeah, definitely challenging. We'll see how that turns out. Let me know what you guys think. Really appreciate you spending your time watching my content here. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll speak soon.